Rebuilding a vintage open steam launch, and this is part 19, more work on the hull and a bit of painting at the end. The glue is now dry and I'm removing all of the spring clamps. I think it's time for an advert for my DVD set, How to Build a Model Steam Launch. On this DVD set there are over 5 hours of comprehensive instructions showing how to build a model steam launch from start to finish. It is available from my website and the web address is always on screen on every one of my videos. And during the short advert for my 3 DVD set How to Build a Model Steam Launch, you haven't missed much. I've just been cleaning up the hull, vacuuming more of the mess out of it, and now I'm brushing some white spirit onto the hull to clean it even further. But now it's down to business. This is the same size of gas tank that I would normally fit in a boat of this size, but unfortunately there's not enough room for it. As this hull is made from a solid piece of wood, and it's quite thick, I could chisel out some of the wood so that the tank fits under the bow. I really am not going to do that. The problem is the valve. Like always, they are too tall. So I thought I would quickly dismantle this one and have a look at it. You will notice that I can leave my Barco spanners clamped onto the nuts. Actually, whilst I just did that, I was having a drink of my cup of tea before it went cold. You will notice that there's quite a good amount of thread sealant on the screw thread at the top of the body of the fitting, and also there is an O-ring in the nut itself, so this should be very gas tight. With the valve removed, it still didn't fit under the front of the boat, so I put it all back together, and I used some Loctite 542 on the thread and tightened the nut securely. Note to self, for future reference, modifying the gas valves is not a good idea. Once I put the valve back together, I screwed it onto the canister properly, just to make sure that it didn't leak, and of course it didn't. So what options do I now have? I could put one of these in. This is a Maxsteam gas tank. It's not actually mine, it belongs to a customer, and it's been on my shelf for quite a while, so I won't be using this. I'm not a great fan of external gas tanks. Where possible, I always try and use the commercial canisters that you get from DIY shops or camping shops, especially if the tank is hidden, like it would be in this particular boat. If you have no choice but to use a visible tank in the boat, a copper tank like this can look quite good, especially if it's clad in some mahogany with brass bands around it. But I still prefer the simplicity of having a removable throwaway canister. And luckily there is a gas canister one size smaller than this. It's called a C100, and that will fit perfectly on a small shelf in the bow of the boat. There are going to be 1 or 2 difficulties with the radio control system in this boat, just because of the design of the boat. This clip shows the possibility of fixing a servo in this position, not of course with a spring clamp, it would need a mounting making. But mechanically it's almost impossible to put the servo in the right place to allow it to control the rudder underneath the deck. It's looking very likely that I will be using mini servos. I don't just mean any mini servo, I mean the mini servos with metal gears that are very powerful. And if one is not powerful enough, I will use 2. It's not a massive rudder, but in the water the rudder will have quite a lot of pressure against it. So if I get a servo that is too weak, it will load the battery. What I need to do is make a removable metal arm that clamps to the rudder shaft. And the only way this arm can point is forward, and then if I have a servo at one side with a linkage to the arm, the rudder will move okay. And if that's not strong enough, I will use one at the other side too. I'm jumping the gun a little bit talking about servos operating rudders because this rudder is not going to be operated by anything in its present state. As I mentioned in the last episode, this is a pond launch, so it really didn't matter if the rudder was slightly out, but for radio control it needs to be very accurate. I cannot have the rudder binding. And no matter how many servos I decide to use to move the rudder, it's not going to move if it's like this. This is a piece of 5/16 bar which shows how far out the rudder is from the bracket at the bottom. So what I'm having to do, and I don't really like doing this, but it will be okay, I'm enlarging the hole slightly, which gives me a little bit of leeway, and yes, that's a little bit better, but it's still not right. But by carefully working this 5/16 drill back and forth, eventually I get this metal bar to line up perfectly with the bracket at the bottom. The finished stern tube is going to be quite a complicated affair. It's going to be in 2 parts, because there has to be a space for the rudder's actuating lever that I've yet to make. What I'm doing in this clip is just marking off a piece of brass to the right length. I cut it on the bandsaw. I could have put it in the lathe and parted it off, but I get fed up of doing that. And as these videos are mainly tutorials, it just shows yet another way of cutting a piece of metal bar. The piece of brass that you saw me marking out and cutting has now got a 3/16 of an inch hole down the centre of it. I also faced off both ends of this in the lathe as well. Once I was happy that this brass part was a perfect fit and everything aligned at the bottom of the rudder, I turned up a brass disc in the lathe and silver soldered that to one end of the brass tube, but at an angle, as you can see, because the decking slopes and is at an angle to the perpendicular. Then I cleaned the part up on a piece of 400 grit wet dry sandpaper and later polished the part on my polishing spindle. The rudder shaft is 3/16 of an inch in diameter, and so is the propeller shaft, so temporarily use the propeller shaft to check the alignment, and everything's fine. So replace the propeller shaft with the rudder, and then I pressed the fitting into place. And as you can see, it's quite a tight fit in the boat. And I haven't got this in perfectly, it needs to be rotated slightly, so that the angle of the brass disc on the stern tube matches exactly the slope of the decking at the stern end of the boat. In this clip I'm just screwing the original fitting onto the top of the rudder shaft, and as you can see, everything is very free running now. Before I finally fit the rudder, I will make a spacer to limit its up and down movement, but it's okay for the moment. Time now to have a look at the superstructure. This needs a thoroughly good clean, so the first thing I'm doing is vacuuming out all the dust. I've already used my paintbrush to try and loosen it, but this is about the best I can do. The vacuum cleaner gets rid of the thick of it, but I really think I need to remove the seating. It's very difficult to clean this part of the boat with this seating unit in place. There's not a problem with the bow section, because the seating's already loose, but this is stuck fast. But with a bit of gentle persuasion, and without breaking any part of the boat, I can remove the seating. The best way to remove things like this is to shock them. Just tap them gently with something solid. Everything's actually loose now, apart from the rear one. There it goes. And then there's one more left, which is the very back corner, I think. When you're doing a job like this, you need to have considerable confidence in your ability. And I'd love to say, oh yeah, I've spent a lifetime removing seating from model boats, but this is not the case. But I've got a good bit of common sense, and I just figure that if I slightly shock the parts, they will let go, because they're only glued down to the deck. And there was no cyanoacrylate adhesive 50 years ago. And as you can see, they've come away very clean, complete with the glue. What I'm going to do is clean up all these parts separately and re-glue the legs to the seating unit, but then I'm not going to glue the seating unit legs back to the inner decking. So with the seating unit out of the way on the other bench, I'm now using my small paintbrush to just loosen the dirt, and as this boat sat in a forlorn state for many years, there's plenty of dust in here. With all the dust loosened, it's very easy for the vacuum cleaner to remove it. And once all the dust is removed, I'm going to go over it with some white spirit. Not cellulose thinners, you must never use strong solvents on a job like this. Using this white spirit just removes the dirt and grime, it does not remove the paint. This white spirit also acts as a degreaser, so what I'm doing is giving the inside of the hull a coat of white spirit, and when the white spirit is evaporated, it's time to paint the inside of the boat. The paint I'm using is made by a company called Hammerite, and it's called Bike Pot Black, and it's for painting black motorcycles. And it's quite good paint really. The good thing about it is that it looks a little bit like bitumen, and if this was a full-size steamboat, I'm sure that the internal part of it would probably be painted in bitumen. The fumes from this paint are really horrible. I kept thinking I was seeing my how to build a model steam launch right in front of my face, but then it fell over, so I had to stop painting and go and lay in a very dark room for several hours. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.